The morning sun barely broke through the thick pine trees when Thomas Brennan swung his axe for the 100th time that day. Sweat dripped down his weathered face as another massive tree crashed to the forest floor. At 42 years old, Thomas had spent the last 15 years of his life in these Oregon woods. Far away from any town or neighbor, his cabin sat in a clearing he had carved out himself, surrounded by nothing but towering trees and the sound of his own breathing. Every morning, he would wake up to complete silence. Every evening, he would sit on his porch and watch the sunset alone. The only voices he heard were his own prayers, whispered into the darkness before sleep took him. Thomas had not always been alone. Once, he had a wife named Catherine and a baby daughter. But fever had taken them both during a harsh winter, leaving him with nothing but memories and a pain that never seemed to heal. That was when he packed his few belongings and headed into the wilderness, thinking that maybe if he got far enough away from people, the hurt would stop following him. But 15 years later, the loneliness had become like a heavy coat he could never take off. He talked to himself while chopping wood. He saved interesting stories from his monthly trips to town, planning to tell them to someone who was never there. At night, he would set 2 plates on his table out of habit, then quietly put one away. His prayers had become more desperate lately. "Lord," he would whisper, kneeling beside his simple wooden bed, "I know I chose this life, but I'm tired of being alone. Send me someone to share this place with, someone who needs what I can give, and who can give me what I need." Millbrook took him 3 hours on horseback. The small town bustled with activity compared to his quiet forest home. Thomas tied his horse outside Peterson's general store and walked inside, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. He needed supplies, flour, salt, coffee, and a few other basics that would last him another month. Old Peterson greeted him with a nod. "Thomas, good to see you again. The usual supplies?" "Yes, sir. Maybe add some extra sugar this time." Thomas had been thinking about trying to make some jam from the wild berries near his cabin. Not that he had anyone to share it with, but it would be something different. As Peterson gathered his items, Thomas heard shouting from outside. Through the store window, he could see a crowd gathering near the saloon. Curious, he stepped outside. To see what was happening, the sight made his stomach turn. A man in his 50s, clearly drunk and desperate, was arguing with 2 rough-looking men in expensive suits. Between them stood a young woman, probably in her early 20s, with her head down and her hands tied. "Please," the drunk man was saying, "give me more time. I can get you the rest of the money." One of the well-dressed men laughed coldly. "Jeremiah, you've had 6 months. You owe us $800, and we're done waiting." Thomas moved closer, pretending to examine the goods in a nearby shop window. The young woman looked up briefly, and he saw fear in her dark eyes that reminded him of a trapped animal. "I'm telling you," the drunk man Jeremiah continued, "she's worth more than what I owe. She can cook, clean, take care of a house. Someone will pay good money for her." Thomas felt sick. He had heard of such things happening, but seeing it with his own eyes was different. The woman, she had to be Jeremiah's daughter, stood perfectly still, but Thomas could see her hand shaking. "We don't want her," the first man said. "We want our money. You have until sunset to find $800, or we'll take it out of your hide." The crowd was growing larger, but no one seemed willing to step in. Thomas watched as Jeremiah fell to his knees, begging. The young woman's eyes darted around the crowd, looking for help that wasn't coming. Thomas found himself walking forward. Before he had time to think about it, "I'll give you $500 for her," he said quietly. The crowd turned to stare at him. Jeremiah looked up with desperate hope in his eyes. The 2 men in suits looked Thomas up and down, taking in his simple clothes and calloused hands. "You got that kind of money, mountain man?" one of them asked. Thomas nodded. He had been saving his earnings for years, with nothing to spend them on. The money sat in a tin box under his floorboards, growing larger each month, but never bringing him any happiness. "Make it 600, the other man said, "and we'll call Jeremiah's debt paid." Thomas looked at the young woman again. She was staring at him now, and he could see intelligence behind the fear in her eyes. Something about her reminded him of Catherine, not in looks, but in the way she held herself despite being afraid. "Deal," Thomas said. The next few minutes passed in a blur. Thomas walked to the bank, withdrew $600 from his account, and handed it over. The men in suits counted the money carefully, then walked away without another word. Jeremiah mumbled something that might have been thanks, then stumbled toward the saloon. Thomas found himself standing alone with the young woman. She was taller than he had first thought, with strong shoulders and hands that showed she was no stranger to hard work. Her dress was worn but clean, and she kept her chin up despite everything that had just happened. "What's your name?" Thomas asked gently. "Mercy," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm Thomas. I live up in the mountains, about 3 hours north of here." He paused, not sure how to explain what he was thinking. "I want you to know I didn't buy you to hurt you or use you badly. I live alone, and I could use help with cooking and keeping house, but I won't force you to do anything you don't want to do." Mercy looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to believe him. Finally, she nodded. "Do you have anything you need to gather?" Thomas asked. She shook her head. "Everything I own is what I'm wearing." Thomas felt another stab of anger at Jeremiah, but he pushed it down. What was done. Now he had to figure out how to help this young woman, and maybe, just maybe, they could help each other. He untied her hands and helped her onto his horse. As they rode out of town, Thomas found himself praying again, but this time it was different. Instead of asking for something, he was asking for wisdom to do right by the person God had placed in his path. Mercy sat quietly behind him as they traveled through the forest. She didn't speak, but Thomas could feel her watching everything. The trees, the path, the way the sunlight filtered through the branches. It was as if she was memorizing every detail. When they finally reached his cabin, Thomas helped her down from the horse. She stood in the clearing, looking around at his simple home, the vegetable garden, the neat pile of chopped wood. "It's not much," Thomas said, "but it's peaceful." Mercy nodded again, still not speaking much. Thomas showed her inside, pointing out the spare room that had been empty for 15 years. "This can be your room," he said. "There's a lock on the inside of the door if it makes you feel safer." For the first time since he had met her, Mercy's expression softened slightly. "Thank you," she said. As Thomas prepared a simple dinner, he wondered what he had gotten himself into. He'd prayed for companionship, but he had not expected it to come like this. He glanced at Mercy, who sat quietly at his table, and realized that maybe God answered prayers in ways people never expected. The sun was setting outside his cabin windows, painting everything in golden light. For the first time in 15 years, Thomas was not eating dinner alone. It was not the companionship he had imagined, but perhaps it was exactly what both of them needed. The first week was harder than Thomas had imagined. Mercy moved through his cabin like a ghost, doing her work quietly and efficiently, but never speaking unless he asked her a direct question. She would wake before dawn, prepare breakfast, clean the dishes, and then disappear into the forest for hours at a time. Thomas worried about her getting lost, but she always returned before sunset. He tried to give her space while still being kind. When he came in from chopping wood, he would find his clothes washed and hung on the line, his floors swept clean, and a hot meal waiting on the stove. But Mercy herself would be nowhere in sight. It was as if she could sense when he was coming. Holman would vanish before he arrived. At night, Thomas could hear her moving around in her room. Sometimes he heard what sounded like crying, soft and muffled by her pillow. Other times, he heard her talking quietly to herself, though he could never make out the words. He wanted to knock on her door and ask if she was all right, but something told him that would only make things worse. The breakthrough came on a Thursday morning when Thomas woke up feeling dizzy and weak. He had been working extra hard lately, trying to cut enough wood to last through the winter months. His body was telling him to slow down, but his mind kept pushing forward. He stumbled out of his room and found Mercy already in the kitchen, stirring something that smelled like heaven in a pot on the stove. "Morning," he said, his voice rougher than usual. Mercy looked up at him, and her eyes widened. "You look terrible," she said. and then immediately looked surprised that she had spoken so directly. Thomas tried to laugh, but it came out as more of a cough. "I feel about as good as I look." Without saying another word, Mercy guided him to his chair and pressed a cup of hot tea into his hands. The liquid was dark and bitter, but it seemed to cut through the fog in his head. "What is this?" he asked. "Bark and ginger," Mercy said, already moving back to the stove. "My mama taught me before she died. It helps with fever and pain." Thomas sipped the tea and felt some of his strength returning. "Your mother was a healer?" Mercy nodded, keeping her back to him as she ladled something into a bowl. "Kinds of things about plants and medicines. Said it was a gift passed down through the women in our family." She placed a bowl of soup in front of him that smelled like chicken and herbs. Thomas took a spoonful and nearly groaned with pleasure. It was better than anything he had eaten in years. "This is incredible," he said. For the first time since she had arrived, Mercy smiled. It was small and quickly hidden, but Thomas saw it. "Mama's recipe?" she said quietly. She always said food was medicine too. Thomas ate slowly, savoring both the soup and the fact that Mercy was finally talking to him. When he finished, she immediately refilled his bowl. "You don't have to take care of me," Thomas said. "I'll be fine." Mercy looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You took me away from a bad situation," she said simply. "The least I can do is make sure you don't die from working too hard." That afternoon, Thomas tried to go out and chop wood, but Mercy blocked his path to the door. "No," she said firmly. "You need to rest." "I have work to do," Thomas protested. "The trees will still be there tomorrow," Mercy replied. "But if you collapse in the forest, who's going to find you?" Thomas realized she was right. He spent the day resting while Mercy bustled around the cabin, organizing things and preparing meals. Every few hours, she would bring him more of her bitter tea and check to make sure he was drinking it. By evening, Thomas was feeling much better. As they sat down for dinner, he found himself really looking at Mercy for the first time. Younger than he had first thought, probably only 20 or 21, but there was something in her eyes that spoke of experiences far beyond her years. "Can I ask you something?" Mara said carefully. Mercy tensed slightly but nodded. "How long was your father? How long were things bad at home?" Mercy was quiet for so long that Thomas thought she wouldn't answer. Finally, she spoke. "Mama died 3 years ago," she said. "Papa started drinking heavy after that. Then he started gambling. First it was just a few dollars here and there, but then he got in deeper and deeper." She paused, stirring her soup without eating it. "The men who came for the money? They weren't the first ones. Papa had been promising me to different people for months, trying to buy himself more time." Thomas felt anger rise in his chest, but he kept his voice calm. "I'm sorry you went through that." Mercy shrugged. "Mama always said that God has a plan, even when we can't see it. Maybe this is part of that plan. Do you really believe that?" Thomas asked. Mercy looked at him with those intelligent eyes. "I have to," she said. "Otherwise, none of it makes sense." Over the next few days, their conversations grew longer. Thomas learned that Mercy could read and write, which was unusual. For someone in her situation, her mother had taught her, saying that knowledge was something no one could take away. Mercy learned that Thomas had been a carpenter before he became a lumberjack. He had built their cabin himself, along with all the furniture in it. She seemed impressed by his skill, running her hands along the smooth wood of the table and chairs. "You're very good at this," she said one evening, as she examined the intricate carving on a wooden box he had made. "It helps pass the time," Thomas said. "When you live alone, you need something to keep your hands busy. You don't have to live alone anymore," Mercy said quietly, and then looked surprised again that she had spoken so openly. Thomas felt something warm settle in his chest. "No," he agreed. "I guess I don't." The change in their relationship was gradual, but noticeable. Mercy stopped disappearing when Thomas came home from work. Instead, she would be there to greet him, sometimes with a cup of coffee or a slice of bread fresh from the oven. She began sitting with him on the porch in the evenings, both of them watching the sunset in comfortable silence. One evening, As they sat listening to the sounds of the forest, Mercy spoke up. "Do you ever wonder why things happen the way they do?" she asked. Thomas considered the question. "Every day," he said, "especially lately." "I used to be angry," Mercy said. "Angry at Papa for drinking, angry at God for taking Mama, angry at the world for being so hard." She paused. "But sitting here watching the sun go down, I don't feel angry anymore." "What do you feel?" Thomas asked. Mercy was quiet for a long moment. "Peaceful," she said finally. "For the first time in years, I feel peaceful." Thomas nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for 15 years was starting to lift, replaced by something he had almost forgotten existed: hope. As they prepared to go inside for the night, Thomas found himself offering up a different kind of prayer than usual. Instead of asking for something, he found himself saying thank you. Thank you for bringing Mercy into his life. And thank you for giving him the chance to help someone who needed it. He didn't know what the future would bring, but for the first time in years, he was looking forward to finding out. Winter came early that year, bringing with it the kind of cold that made every breath visible and every step on the frozen ground sound like breaking glass. Thomas had been through many winters alone in his cabin, but this one felt different. The presence of another person changed everything about how he prepared for the long, dark months ahead. Mercy had thrown herself into the task of getting ready for winter with an energy that surprised Thomas. She spent days preserving vegetables from his garden, hanging herbs to dry from the cabin's rafters, and making sure every crack in the walls was sealed against the cold wind. "You act like you've done this before," Thomas said one afternoon as he watched her expertly smoke fish they had caught from the nearby stream. "Mama and I lived through some hard winters," Mercy replied, carefully turning the fish over the fire. "She taught me that winter doesn't care if you're ready or not. It comes anyway." Thomas nodded, understanding the wisdom in those words. He had learned the same lesson the hard way during his first few years alone in the mountains. As the days grew shorter and the snow began to fall in earnest, Thomas and Mercy found themselves spending more time together inside the cabin. The evenings were long, and after the dinner dishes were washed and put away, they would sit by the fire and talk. It was during one of these evenings that Thomas learned more about Mercy's gift for healing. She had been quiet for most of the end. Day and Thomas could sense something was troubling her. "What's on your mind?" he asked gently. Mercy looked up from the sewing she had been working on. "I've been thinking about my mother," she said. "She died this time of year, 3 years ago." Thomas set down the piece of wood he had been carving. "What was she like?" A small smile crossed Mercy's face. "She was strong, stronger than anyone I've ever known. Even when she was sick, she kept taking care of people. Neighbors would come to our house at all hours, asking for her help with their ailments. She sounds like a remarkable woman." She was. Mercy's voice grew softer. "She used to say that healing wasn't just about knowing which plants to use or how to set a broken bone. She said it was about seeing what people really needed and helping them find it." Thomas thought about this for a moment. "What do you think she meant by that?" Mercy was quiet for a long time, her needle moving steadily through the fabric in her lap. "I think she meant that sometimes people are hurt in ways that medicine can't fix. Sometimes they need someone to believe in them or to show them that they matter." The conversation stayed with Thomas long after they had said goodnight and gone to their separate rooms. He found himself thinking about the way Mercy had cared for him when he was sick, how she had seemed to know exactly what he needed before he knew it himself. December brought the heaviest snows Thomas had seen in years. The drifts piled up against the cabin walls, and the wind howled through the trees with a sound like something alive and angry. On the worst days, they couldn't even open the door to get outside. It was during one of these storms that Thomas fell ill again, but this time it was worse than before. He woke up one morning with a fever so high that he could barely stand. His head pounded and his body ached from head to toe. Mercy took one look at him and immediately went into action. Made him a bed near the fireplace where she could keep the fire going and watch over him. She brewed teas from the herbs she had dried, made broths from the preserved meat, kept cool cloths on his forehead when the fever was at its worst. For 3 days, Thomas drifted in and out of consciousness. Sometimes he would wake to find Mercy sitting beside him, reading aloud from an old book. Other times, he would hear her humming softly as she worked around the cabin. On the fourth day, the fever broke. Thomas woke up feeling weak but clear-headed for the first time in days. Mercy was asleep in the chair beside him, her head resting on her arms. She looked exhausted. "Mercy," he said softly. She woke up immediately, her eyes focusing on his face. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been run over by a horse," Thomas said, managing a weak smile. "But better." Relief flooded Mercy's features. "I was worried," she admitted. "The fever was so high and you were talking in your sleep, saying things that didn't make sense." Thomas felt embarrassed. "What kind of things?" Mercy hesitated. "You talked about your wife and daughter? About how much you missed them?" Thomas felt his chest tighten. He had never told Mercy about Catherine and little Rose, though he supposed it wasn't surprising that their names would come up in his fevered dreams. "I'm sorry," he said. "I don't usually talk about them." "Why not?" Mercy asked gently. Thomas struggled to find the words. "Because it hurts too much," he said finally. "Because talking about them makes me remember what I lost." Mercy nodded as if she understood completely. Mama used to say that grief is like a deep cut. If you don't clean it out and let it heal properly, it just gets infected and causes more pain. "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe keeping their memory locked away isn't helping you heal. Maybe talking about them would honor their memory instead of making the pain worse." Thomas considered this. "What were they like?" Mercy asked softly. Thomas closed his eyes, letting himself remember. Catherine was beautiful, but not in the way that made her vain. She was beautiful because she was kind. She could find something good to say about anyone, even people who didn't deserve it. He paused and rose. She was just a baby, but she had these bright eyes that seemed to take in everything. She would laugh at the smallest things. "They sound wonderful," Mercy said. "They were." Thomas opened his eyes and looked at Mercy. "They died of fever like what I just had. I tried everything I could think of to save them, but nothing worked." "Is that why you came out here? To get away from the memories?" Thomas nodded. "I thought if I could get far enough away from everything that reminded me of them, the pain would stop, but it didn't work. The pain followed me here." Mercy was quiet for a moment. "Maybe the pain followed you because you were carrying it with you," she said. "Maybe you don't need to get away from the memories. Maybe you need to learn to carry them differently." Thomas thought about this as he recovered over the next few days. Mercy had a way of saying things that made him see his life from a different angle. She didn't try to fix his pain or tell him he should feel differently. She just listened and offered her own perspective as his strength returned. Thomas found himself sharing more stories about Catherine and Rose. He told Mercy about the way Catherine would sing while she cooked and how Rose had just started to walk before she got sick. Instead of making the pain worse, talking about them seemed to ease something in his chest that had been tight for years. "You know," Thomas said one evening as they sat by the fire, "I think your mother was right about healing. Sometimes people do need something that medicine can't provide." Mercy looked up from her sewing. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you've helped me heal from something I've been carrying for 15 years. Not with herbs or teas, but just by listening and caring." Mercy's cheeks turned pink. "I haven't done anything special." "Yes, you have," Thomas said firmly. "You've shown me that it's possible to remember the people I loved without letting the grief consume me. That's a kind of healing I never thought I'd find." Outside, the wind continued to howl, but inside the cabin, there was warmth and peace. Thomas realized that for the first time since Catherine and Rose had died, he was genuinely happy. Not just content or less sad, but actually happy, as they prepared for bed that night. Thomas found himself grateful for the storm that had forced them to depend on each other. Sometimes, he thought, the most important healing happened when people had nowhere to run and nothing to do but be honest with each other. Spring arrived with a burst of wildflowers and the sound of melting snow rushing down the mountainside. Thomas felt lighter than he had in years as he worked in his garden, preparing the soil for another year of vegetables. Mercy was beside him. her hands dirty from planting seeds, humming one of the songs her mother had taught her. "I never thought I'd enjoy gardening this much," Thomas said, wiping sweat from his forehead. Mercy smiled. "Mama always said there was something hopeful about planting seeds. You put them in the ground not knowing exactly what will grow, but trusting that something good will come." Thomas was about to respond when he heard something that made his blood run cold, the sound of horses approaching through the forest. He hadn't heard that sound in months, and visitors to his remote cabin were never good news. "Mercy," he said quietly, "get inside the house, now." The tone of his voice made Mercy look up sharply. She saw the fear in his eyes and immediately stood up, brushing the dirt from her hands. "What is it?" she asked. "I don't know yet, but I want you safe inside." Through the trees, Thomas could see 3 men on horseback riding toward his cabin. Even from a distance, he could tell they were trouble. They rode with the kind of confidence that came from being used to getting their way through intimidation. Mercy grabbed his arm. "Thomas, those are the same men from town, the ones Papa owed. Money, too." Thomas felt his heart sink. He had hoped they would never see those men again, but apparently their business with Jeremiah wasn't finished. The 3 riders emerged from the tree line and stopped in front of the cabin. The leader, a man with cold eyes and expensive clothes that looked out of place in the wilderness, dismounted and walked toward Thomas. "Well, well," the man said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "If it isn't the mountain man who thought he could buy his way into our business." "I paid you what you asked for," Thomas said evenly. "Our business is finished." The man laughed. "See, that's where you're wrong. Turns out old Jeremiah owed us more than we thought. A lot more. And since you took his collateral, we figure you're responsible for the rest of his debt." "That's not how it works," Thomas said, trying to keep his voice calm. "It's how it works when we say it works," the second man said, still mounted on his horse. "Where's the girl?" Thomas stepped protectively in front of the cabin door. "She's under my protection now. You have no claim on her." The leader's smile disappeared. "Friend, I don't think you understand the situation here. Jeremiah owes us $1,200 total. You paid $600. That leaves $600 still owed, plus interest. The girl comes with us, or you pay up." "I don't have that kind of money," Thomas said, though it wasn't entirely true. He had some savings left, but not enough to cover what they were demanding. "Then we take the girl," the third man said, reaching for something under his coat. Thomas tensed, ready to fight if necessary. He wasn't armed. But he wasn't going to let them take Mercy without a struggle. That's when something extraordinary happened. The cabin door opened, and Mercy stepped outside. Thomas tried to motion for her to go back inside, but she walked past him with a calmness that seemed to fill the air around them. "You need to leave," Mercy said quietly, looking directly at the leader. The man laughed. "Little girl, you're in no position to be making demands." But as he spoke, his horse began to shift nervously beneath him. The other horses started backing away, their eyes wide with what looked like fear. "I said you need to leave," Mercy repeated, and this time, her voice carried something that made the hair on Thomas's arms stand up. The sky, which had been clear and blue just moments before, began to darken with clouds that seemed to come from nowhere. The wind picked up, making the trees around the clearing bend and sway. "What's happening?" the second man asked, his voice shaking. The leader tried to maintain his composure, but Thomas could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air. "It's just a storm coming in," he said, but he didn't sound convinced. Mercy took another step forward, and the horses began to panic. The leader's mount reared up, nearly throwing him to the ground. The other 2 men struggled to control their animals as the wind grew stronger. "This land is protected," Mercy said, her voice carrying clearly over the sound of the wind. "No harm will come to those who dwell here, and no evil will prosper in this place." Thomas stared at Mercy in amazement. She stood perfectly still in the growing storm, her hair whipping around her face, but she seemed completely unafraid. There was something about her presence that felt larger than her physical form, as if she was connected to something powerful and unseen. The leader tried to advance toward the cabin, but his horse refused to move forward. Every time he urged the animal closer, it would rear up and back away, as if it could see something the men couldn't. "This isn't over," the leader shouted over the wind, but Thomas could hear the fear in his voice. Yes, it is, Mercy said simply. The storm reached its peak, with lightning flashing in the dark clouds overhead and thunder rumbling through the mountains. The three men fought to control their terrified horses, and Thomas watched in amazement as a bolt of lightning struck a tree. Just 20 feet from where the leader sat on his mount, the smell of burning wood filled the air, and that was enough. For the three men, they turned their horses and rode away as fast as they could, not looking back. As soon as they disappeared into the forest, the storm began to calm. The wind died down, the clouds started to break apart, and within minutes, the sun was shining again, as if nothing had happened. Thomas turned to look at Mercy, who was standing exactly where she had been, perfectly calm and composed. "How did you do that?" he asked, his voice filled with awe. Mercy looked at him with those intelligent eyes. And for the first time, Thomas saw something in them that he had never noticed before, a deep, quiet strength that seemed to come from somewhere, beyond the physical world. "My mama didn't just teach me about healing plants," Mercy said softly. "She taught me that some people are born with gifts that go beyond what most folks can see or understand." Thomas walked closer to her, still trying to process what he had just witnessed. "What kind of gifts?" "The gift of sight," Mercy said. "The ability to see things as they really are, not just as they appear to be. And sometimes, when people with this gift pray for protection, their prayers are answered in ways that can't be explained." Thomas thought about all the times he had prayed for companionship, for someone to share his life with. He had never imagined that his prayers would be answered by someone with abilities like Mercy's. "Is that why you always seem to know things before they happen?" Thomas asked. "Why you knew I was getting sick before I did? Why you always seem to understand what people need?" Mercy nodded. "Mama said it was a gift that ran in our family, passed down from mother to daughter. She taught me how to use it to help people, but also how to hide it when necessary." "Why did you hide it from me?" "Because most people are afraid of what they don't understand," Mercy said. "And I've learned that fear can make people do terrible things, even good people." Thomas considered this. "I'm not afraid," he said finally. Mercy looked at him carefully, as if she was seeing him with new eyes. "No," she said with surprise in her voice. "You're not, are you? Should I be?" Mercy smiled, and it was the most beautiful smile Thomas had ever seen. "No," she said, "you shouldn't be, because this gift isn't meant to harm anyone. It's meant to protect and heal and bring peace." As they walked back toward the cabin, Thomas felt like he was seeing Mercy clearly for the first time. She wasn't just a young woman who needed his protection. She was someone with abilities that went far beyond anything he had ever imagined. "Is this why you came into my life?" Thomas asked. "Because I needed protection too?" Mercy stopped walking and looked at him. "Maybe we both needed protection," she said. "Maybe we both needed healing. And maybe we both needed someone who could see us for who we really are." Thomas realized that his prayers had been answered in ways he never could have expected. He had asked for companionship, but God had sent him someone whose gifts complemented his own strengths perfectly. Where he was practical and grounded, she was intuitive and spiritually gifted. Where she needed physical protection and stability, he could provide safety and security. "Those men won't come back," Mercy said with certainty. "How do you know?" "Because they felt something today that they can't explain, and that kind of fear doesn't fade quickly. They'll tell themselves it was just a coincidence, but deep down, they'll know better." As the sun set that evening, Thomas and Mercy sat on their porch as they had done so many times before. But tonight felt different. Tonight, Thomas understood that he was sharing his life with someone truly extraordinary, and that the loneliness he had carried for so many years was finally completely gone. Summer brought a peace to the mountain that Thomas had never experienced before. The cabin felt different now, filled with a warmth that had nothing to do with the season. It was as if the very walls had absorbed the happiness that lived there, and visitors could feel it the moment they stepped inside, and there were visitors now. Word had somehow spread through the nearby towns about the woman on the mountain, who could help people with problems that doctors couldn't solve. They came quietly, usually alone, carrying burdens that weighed more than the packs on their backs. The first was an old farmer named William, who had been having terrible nightmares. Since his son died in a logging accident, it heard whispers in the town's saloon about the mountain woman who could see things others couldn't. Thomas found him standing at the edge of their clearing one morning, hat in his hands, looking uncertain about whether to approach. "Can I help you?" Thomas called out, setting down his axe. The man looked relieved to see another man.
Do you mind?
"I'm looking for the woman they say lives here, the one who has special abilities." Thomas nodded toward the cabin. "That would be Mercy. She's inside preparing breakfast. Come up to the house." As they walked toward the cabin, Thomas could see the exhaustion in the man's face, the dark circles under his eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. Mercy appeared in the doorway before they reached it, as if she had sensed them coming. She took one look at William, and her expression softened with understanding. "You haven't been sleeping," she said gently. William's eyes widened in surprise. "How did you know?" "It's written all over your face," Mercy said kindly. "Come inside. Let me make you some tea." Thomas watched as Mercy worked with William, listening to his story with patience and compassion. She didn't claim to perform miracles or promise things she couldn't deliver. Instead, she made him tea with herbs that would help him rest, taught him prayers that would calm his mind, and most importantly, helped him understand that his son's death wasn't his fault. "The dead don't want us to suffer," Mercy told William as he prepared to leave. "They want us to live and be happy and remember them with joy, not pain." William left that afternoon looking like a different man. The weight he had been carrying seemed lighter, and there was hope in his eyes that hadn't been there when he arrived. "How do you know these things?" Thomas asked Mercy that evening. "Sometimes I just know," Mercy said simply. A young mother whose baby wouldn't stop crying found peace when Mercy showed her how to create a calm, peaceful environment. In her home, an old woman who had been afraid of dying learned to see death not as an ending, but as a journey to something better. Thomas marveled at how Mercy helped each person who came to them. She never asked for payment, though people often left gifts of food or small items they had made. She simply shared her gift freely, the way her mother had taught her. But it wasn't just Mercy's abilities that drew people to their mountain. It was the atmosphere of the place itself. Thomas began to notice that animals seemed more peaceful around their cabin. Birds sang more beautifully, and even the wild creatures of the forest would come closer than usual, as if they sensed that this was a safe place. One evening, in late summer, as Thomas and Mercy sat on their porch watching the sunset, she turned to him with a serious expression. "Thomas," she said, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "When you pray at night, what do you pray for now?" Thomas thought about this. His prayers had changed completely since Mercy had come into his life. "I pray to thank God for bringing you here," he said honestly, "and I pray that I'll be worthy of the gift he gave me." Mercy smiled. "What gift?" Thomas said simply. "Your friendship, your presence, your ... love." The word hung in the air between them. They had never spoken directly about love, though Thomas had felt it growing in his heart for months. He had been afraid to say anything, worried that it might change the comfortable partnership they had built. Mercy reached over and took his hand. "I love you too," she said softly. "I think I started falling in love with you the day you took care of me when I was scared and alone. You showed me what kindness looked like." Thomas felt his heart swell with happiness. "I never thought I would love anyone again after Catherine and Rose died. But what I feel for you, it's different from what I felt for them, but just as real. Different." "How?" Mercy asked. Thomas considered his words carefully. "With Catherine, I was young and thought love meant never being apart, never facing hardship. With you, I've learned that real love means choosing to face whatever comes together. It means seeing all of someone, their gifts, their fears, their past, and choosing to love all of it." Mercy squeezed his hand. "Mama used to say that some people are meant to find each other, no matter how impossible it seems. She said that when two souls are supposed to be together, God will move mountains to make it happen. Is that what you think happened with us?" Thomas asked. "I know it is," Mercy said with certainty. Think about all the things that had to happen exactly right for us to meet. Your loneliness, Papa's gambling, those men coming to collect their debt on that exact day, you being in town at that exact moment with enough money to help me. If any one of those things had been different, we never would have found each other. Thomas realized she was right. What had seemed like a series of terrible events had actually been a carefully orchestrated plan to bring them together. As autumn approached, Thomas and Mercy began to talk about making their relationship official. They wanted to be married, but the nearest preacher was 2 days' ride away. Neither of them felt comfortable leaving their mountain for that long. It was Mercy who came up with the solution. "We don't need a preacher," she said one morning. As they worked together in the garden, we could marry ourselves in the eyes of God. "How?" Thomas asked. "By the river," Mercy said, "where the water runs clearest, and the sound of it covers our voices so only God can hear our vows." The ceremony took place on a crisp October morning when the leaves were at their most beautiful. Thomas and Mercy stood by the rushing water, holding hands and speaking the promises they wanted to make to each other. "I promise to love you and protect you for as long as I live," Thomas said, looking into Mercy's eyes. "I promise to honor your gifts and support your calling to help others." "I promise to love you and stand by your side through whatever comes," Mercy replied. "I promise to use my gifts to protect our home and our love." As they spoke their vows, Thomas could swear he felt the presence of something holy surrounding them. The air seemed to shimmer with invisible light, and he heard what sounded like singing, though there was no one there but the two of them. Mercy heard it too. She looked up at the sky with wonder and whispered, "They're here. The angels are here to witness our marriage." Thomas couldn't see what Mercy saw, but he could feel it. The same sense of peace and protection that had driven away the dangerous men now surrounded them like a blessing. That evening, as they sat by their fire as husband and wife, Thomas reflected on how completely his life had changed. He had started as a lonely man praying for companionship, and God had sent him a woman whose spiritual gifts were exactly what he had unknowingly needed. "Do you think we'll have children?" Mercy asked, her head resting on his shoulder. "I hope so," Thomas said. "But even if we don't, I'm happier than I ever thought possible." Mercy smiled. "We will," she said with the same certainty she used when speaking about her spiritual insights. "And they'll be blessed with gifts of their own." As winter approached, again, Thomas and Mercy prepared for it as a true partnership. Their cabin had become more than just a home. It had become a sanctuary where people could find healing, peace, and hope. The lonely lumberjack who had once lived in isolation now lived at the center of a community of people whose lives had been touched by the love and gifts he and Mercy shared. His prayers had been answered not just with companionship, but with a purpose that gave meaning to every day. And sometimes, late at night when the fire burned low and Mercy slept peacefully beside him, Thomas would whisper a prayer of gratitude for the mysterious ways that God had used to bring them together. He'd asked for someone to share his life with, and he had received a partner whose love and gifts had transformed not just his own existence, but the lives of everyone who found their way to the peaceful mountain where miracles happen quietly, one person at a time.